Welcome to the first State of Sustainable Fleets Academy, Charging Infrastructure. My name is Nate Springer. I'm Vice President of Market Development at TRC and the creator of State of Sustainable Fleets, a technology-neutral resource for industry. Thank you for joining today's educational webinar. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. You can submit your questions via the chat box throughout, and I will select those in the course of the discussion that help everyone to understand more about charging infrastructure. We use your feedback to make sure our webinars and series like the Academy are even better the next time around. So please take a moment to complete our 30-second survey that will pop up before you depart. A recording of today's webinar will be available in the next week on the State of Sustainable Fleets and the ACT News websites. You will be notified via email when it is available. Finally, for any technical assistance during the webinar, please email the team at sbabcock, that's S-B-A-B-C-O-C-K, @trccompanies.com. State of Sustainable Fleets is in its 6th year, and it is made possible by the sponsorship and technical support of our title sponsors, Penske, Volvo, and Chevron, as well as our supporting sponsors, S&P Global Mobility, Dana, and Exelon. The next market brief, our annual assessment that sets the record straight in the last year's developments in the market for diesel efficiency, natural gas, battery electric and hydrogen vehicles, and the renewable fuels and electricity that power all of them, will be available on April 28th. Join us at ACT Expo in person for the live launch, or sign up to be notified at stateofsustainablefleets.com. Today's webinar is the first in a 3-part Charging Infrastructure Academy series, brought to you by our gold sponsors, Electrada and First Student, and our silver sponsor, Geotab. This is our first State of Sustainable Fleets Academy to provide deeper education on a topic crucial to the success of one of the technologies covered by State of Sustainable Fleets, battery electric vehicles. We hope that by joining us for a 3-part discussion each week on developing a fleet electrification program today, then on building utility and other key partnerships, finally on integrating charging into fleet management, that fleets on the line especially will have greater success with this clean technology. Join us each week at this same time through April 9th, and if you haven't already registered for the 2 remaining webinars, please do so now by clicking the link dropped into the chat box. Thank you to Electrada, to First Student, and to Geotab for making this possible. And if you want to dive deeper into the trends affecting the fleet industry and the development of clean technologies, please take a moment to download our policy and funding brief just published 3 weeks ago using the link in the chat. Additionally, you can join us in person for the industry's largest advanced clean technology event with fleets, OEMs, infrastructure, and other partners at ACT Expo. Use the code on your screen when you register for $100 off a full conference pass upon checkout. Now, turning to today's topic, we've assembled an expert panel of speakers, including 2 fleets who have deep experience in charging infrastructure, NFI and First Student, charging solution developers, Electrada and First Student, and a leading heavy vehicle manufacturer and partner to many fleets on the line, Volvo Trucks North America. Today's discussion is designed to learn from these leading early adopters and charging infrastructure experts across several critical topics for successful charging infrastructure over the next 55 minutes, including initial planning and opportunity identification, the essential partnerships that are needed, and charging planning. Once again, please use the chat box to ask questions throughout, and I'll select those contributions to the discussion that will help us to better understand charging infrastructure. Let's begin. I want to start with our panel on one of the most important aspects of deploying a battery electric vehicle fleet, which is the identification of opportunity for your fleets. Identifying opportunities for reduced energy prices compared to diesel, grant funding, a duty cycle, or a good technology fit, any or all of the above may be a part of this. There has to be a use case. I want to invite my first 2 expert speakers to introduce themselves and to help our audience understand the initial groundwork that goes into fleet electrification planning. Ryan, if you could please introduce yourself, please introduce Electrada, and talk us through how you help your fleet partners identify those opportunities for electrification, and especially when they have national operations.
Thanks, Nate, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm Ryan Monahan. I'm the Director of Business Development at Electrada. Electrada provides electric fuel to fleets across North America through our full scope charging as a service infrastructure development solution set. We finance, if needed, design, build, operate, and maintain behind the fence fleet charging infrastructure depots with a 99% uptime performance guarantee and a fixed rate of electric fuel over long-term contracts to help de-risk price volatility and energy. We have more than 100 customer commercial fleet depots across North America today and are growing that footprint rapidly. So, as to the core piece of your question, Nate, we think about fleet electrification opportunity identification through a really hardcore lens around EV and ICE TCO parity. And basically, identifying the right markets, the states or right cities, the right specific depot addresses, the specific vehicle VINs, and route use cases where we know we can get to within 10% of diesel or gasoline TCO parity all in. So from a tactical perspective, we have kind of a two-phase overarching approach to helping fleets identify that. And I'll flash on the screen here a quick slide to help illustrate this. So as I mentioned, we really need to identify the right markets in which to electrify. That basically means essentially where the cost of labor and electricity tends to be the cheapest. For many fleets with a national or regional presence, this means that they have the best chance of making a strong business case, oftentimes in the Southeast or Central US, where both of those two key components are way lower in terms of cost. Of course, it's also possible to reach parity on the coast. It just can often be harder or need to be running kind of in the Goldilocks zone of daily average mileage use cases. So once we kind of understand where our fleet customers' distribution of assets lies from a market basis, we kind of dig deeper into those use cases. So kind of on the next slide, you can see we use like a multi-tiered funnel approach. This is an example of one we use with a customer which has a substantial fleet, right? So more than 18,000 vehicles. And we have to really think through all the different components that go into TCO. So we start off with, 18,000 units. We take off the ones that are kind of non-core equipment. We then start to think about, okay, where are the average daily mileage use cases where we can spread the cost of infrastructure across a maximum miles, right? So in light duty, that's usually, more than 40 miles per day. Medium duty, the vehicles that are running about 75 miles, heavy duty about 100 miles. And then we have to think about, seasonal variations. In this case, we was a food company that has ups and downs as the market continues. So how do you add in those additional boosts of mileage throughout the season? And then finally, you want to only be looking to swap out vehicles that are operationally time and overdue for replacement anyway. So you don't want to swap out a brand new beautiful diesel truck that you bought last year. It doesn't make any sense. And finally, you need to understand where the clustering of vehicle assets is so you can reach real economies of scale in terms of cost reductions. So that's kind of how we approach opportunity identification with our partners and customers, kind of really hammering in on real business case TCO parity backed opportunities and trying to find the most legitimate opportunities, out of 18,000 vehicles, 500, right, over the next 5 or 6 years. And that's kind of the hardcore way that we approach this whole problem.
That's great, and I'm sure the within 10% of TCO diesel parity caught a lot of people's attention. Hopefully we'll get to dive into that more throughout the discussion. I'd like to turn to Alexa, who is a fleet owner with a lot of experience in site identification and planning. So Alexa, if you could introduce yourself and NFI, and then share how you lay the initial groundwork for your electrification transition at NFI facilities.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate. Happy to be here. So my name is Alexa Branco. I am NFI's Director of Sustainability, overseeing our strategy for emission reductions as well as the projects that we overtake. So NFI is a third-party supply chain company. We have dedicated transportation, distribution, brokerage, intermodal real estate, and then drayage, which is where we currently have our electric vehicles. So for us, where we really started to look at, this initial groundwork, it kind of came from two levers that really started it, and that would be from the regulation side and our customers. And once we, started getting the pull from them, when we started to dig into, okay, where are we going to actually be deploying this? Of course, operational fit is number one of where, right, exactly as Ryan showed on his slide, of where do these vehicles actually make sense to go and actually, move over to the electric side. So for us, after we kind of go through that same process, kind of found where it fit, we found drayage made the most sense. And from there, also at the same kind of time period, really focusing on any funding and finding partners that have the knowledge that we lack. We are, as noted, a third party supply chain company. We've never owned charging infrastructure and don't have much, on that side. So teaming up with our real estate team to get their construction experts as well on these site planning to ensure that we've got the right locations. It was really, as everything is brand new, we're able to learn a lot of lessons and, make a plan going forward with the right partners.
That's really helpful to hear, Alexa. Thank you so much. And I take it you're already then operating and charging a number of drayage vehicles, like you said, identifying that as a real great use case.
Definitely.
Well, good. I would love to introduce our next two speakers, and to do that and get deeper into this, I know our audience would like to hear what First Student and Volvo consider to be the most attractive duty cycles and favorable sites for electrification. Thinking almost exclusively of operations, and I think both Alexa and Ryan have really touched on this, what types of operations and sites would you consider to be prime for any of our audience fleets to convert to battery electric vehicles? We'll start with Alex at First Student. If you could introduce yourself and explain what you look for in that initial site level evaluation that you perform once you've identified a handful of facilities for potential conversion to battery electric vehicles.
Sure, great. Thank you, Nate. My name's Alex Cook. I'm the Vice President and Chief Engineer for all North American operations of First Student. A little bit about First Student for those in the audience that may not know who we are. We own and operate almost 50,000 yellow school buses. We have almost 600 locations. We operate in 42 states and every province of Canada. We currently have deployed somewhere around 500 BEVs in our journey to Destination Zero. We are on tap to convert another 30,000 of our fleet to BEV by 2035. And so as we take this journey together, as we all have that common goal to leave future generations a better place and take our carbon footprint to zero, site assessment and where you pick and what you look at from a standpoint of the key metrics on deploying battery electric vehicles. I'll walk through some of those in our site assessment, of which we have done on all 600 locations of ours. So we've got a fairly substantial database as to what all those key parameters are. But some of the things that we take a look at, Nate, are, for example, current house power, depending on the number of BEVs that we're going to launch. How much resident electrical horsepower do we have already on site? What is our location of that facility to additional power, i.e. what's the distance from additional feeder lines and or substations? We do a lot with site surveys, so we want to make sure what our boundaries are, any subsurface encumbrances, how much space do we have available on that location, what's the resiliency of the grid? So in other words, we ask the utility, what's their uptime on that particular circuit so that we can then act accordingly, either be it with battery energy storage and or standby generation. Who is the utility responsible for the location? Expansion possibilities, i.e. not only just geometrically in square footage, but as well as on the utility. What's the security of the area? And I can't stress this enough, not only from be it cyber related and or people that may come in, since we're dealing with extremely high power, and how do we protect all those entities? Prevalent voltage available, in the Northeast, we deal a lot with 208 three-phase. Everywhere else in the nation, kind of prevalent 480 three-phase. And if you're doing level 2, what's your access to a lot of 240 single phase. Feeder circuit capacity, we always work with the utility to understand that the feeder circuit that's coming to us, depending on what our load is going to be, and there's a wide range of magnitude of load that we induce, all the way from half of a megawatt upwards of 9-10 megawatts, depending on how many BEVs we're introducing. So it's really key how much horsepower is there. Access to emergency services. So how far is the fire away? How far is emergency medical services? So we do that assessment, and we work with them in parallel to train them on battery electric vehicles on all avenues, nearby to other charging locations. So if something were to happen, is there an Electrify America charging location somewhere? What does that map of congestion look like? So we always have a second backup. Fit to our model. We have a fairly extensive model that looks at several things, not only financially, but as well as operationally, expansion. There's a whole lot of things that go into that, and we rank various key metrics in that, and then we bounce that off of the total fit model. Equipment locations and access. So where would we set all of our infrastructure? What's there? Where's the diesel fuel tank? Where's the gasoline tank? Where's the potential for the LP tanks? How does that all fit together in the jigsaw puzzle? Need for easements. Obviously, the less easements, the better off we are. What's the utility incentive programs? What's the tariffs look like? Is there a BEV tariff? What's peak and off-peak look like for all of our CMS implications? We also reach out to the authority having jurisdiction, so we understand whether that's building and zoning or environmental or whomever that may be, that we craft that relationship. We understand, are there any specific nuances for that location that we need to make sure that we adhere to? And then maintenance considerations. So BEV, being that it is a little bit of a different animal than ICE, we do all of our own internal maintenance, but if there is a need to rely on the OEM or an outside third party, where are they located? What's that distance and what's their expertise? So there's a lot in there, and that's just to name a few of them. When you do a site assessment, to do an overall, hey, is this a good place to deploy BEVs or not?
So it's an extensive diligence process, and I think this is really important. I know we're already getting questions around some of the KPIs on operations. It's also critically important, as you've articulated, Alex, and we'll hear more from Daniel in a second, the KPIs and the diligence required for site planning and selection. So I want to invite the audience to continue to submit their questions and then introduce our fourth panelist and expert, by way of asking Daniel if you could introduce yourself and also explain how Volvo Energy, as the vehicle expert in the room, helps select those vehicles that could be electrified. Are you looking exclusively at range, and what other KPIs might you be looking at that you can build off of what Alex already articulated?
Sure. Thanks, Nate. I'm happy to be here, and let me do a short introduction of myself and Volvo Group then first. So myself, I've been with Volvo for about 20 years, and the last year or so I've been with Volvo Energy, which is it's a business unit within Volvo Group supporting primarily Volvo Trucks, Mack Trucks, Volvo Construction Equipment also, and our dealer networks then with charging and infrastructure solutions. Then, of course, very proud. Volvo Group is a leading force globally and in North America in the shift towards electrification of transportation, mobility and equipment, construction equipment. Then through our dealer networks, we have products and solutions today for local distribution, last mile. In the Volvo VNRE, we were first to market with Class 8 truck in 2019. Mack also offers then LRE for refuse applications, and we also have a medium duty Class 6-7 Mack truck. So again, very proud of what we and customers and dealers have accomplished, but also very humble for what remains. We've been doing diesel trucks for, 100+ years. We've only been doing this for 6 years. We will continue to invest in product platforms, services, and partnerships and continue to lead in this area. Then back to your question there. I don't think it's all about range, but that is one very important parameter, of course. And as Ryan and Alexa described it, I mean, that takes out of scope with today's technology a few applications, right, where you have too much range. And the hurdles to overcome with electrification of fleets is operational parity. That includes range then. It takes out some. Financial parity. Where does it make most sense and where can we get the TCO to work then, including incentives and grants and those kind of things. And then, of course, the third very important piece is charging and infrastructure capabilities. We need to be able to charge the trucks. So with that in mind then, the discussions normally start with more strategic dialogue and understanding of what customer goals and drivers are. And that may look different between regions, business segments, could be company-specific ESG targets, for example. Then also important to emphasize that most of our business originates through our dealer network. There are some larger national accounts, but also there, our dealer partners are critical in support and uptime following the deployment of trucks. So we work very closely together with our dealer partners throughout the process. Following the initial discussions then and everything that Alexa and Ryan brought up, it's about duty cycles, dwell times, site layouts, of course, who's providing electricity. Understanding that and the targets, then you can start doing route recording and route simulations. And that is critical and important then. And we do have a couple of tools there. On the Mac side, we have a route recorder app, and we can see how the BEV, if replacing a diesel, then would operate on those specific routes. We put that data in our proprietary tools. It's a little bit more advanced algorithm if you have refuse, for example, with a body or PTO on versus if it's medium duty, it can be simpler, of course. The operating cycle there and dwell times may sometimes support level 2 chargers at home overnight. That makes things easier on the infrastructure side. Then we also have, together with our dealers, then we can bring in expertise for grants, incentives. We have a captive finance company, financial solutions, service and uptime is important, and then also charging solutions, of course, because we need to look at and together customer cover all those operational, financial, and charging and infrastructure aspects to understand where it makes sense. And then we can start speccing trucks and together then work on timelines and proposed phases for deployment. So it's all about working very closely together with customers to be able to determine best and most complete offer. It is, again, it's a huge transformation and challenge that we're dealing with. So, of course, we need to be humble with that and know that no one knows everything. We're learning every day. Okay.
Yeah, Daniel, this is, first of all, I think I just really appreciate all of you being so open and really laying out so many of the considerations across national level down to the site level and duty cycle level planning. So really appreciate that. I think this, Daniel, you really teed us up nicely for one of the things that we wanted to cover, which is around new partnerships with existing partners, and partnerships with new partners, of which we have a couple on the line today. Maybe sticking with you, Daniel, I'd love to because you've already mentioned the importance of dealerships and working with them and having that support locally. As the representative of the trusted vehicle partner, what do you advise fleets? What do fleets need to do differently with you and their dealership to prepare for electrification? What types of new ways are fleets working with you and your dealership network?
Yeah. So I think it's important to emphasize one thing that is not different, right? I mean, electric vehicles as the ICE vehicles we sell is still business tools, and uptime is key anytime we're dealing with business tools, right? So one thing that we do and have done from the beginning is that wherever electric trucks are deployed in our field, our dealers are EV certified, meaning that they have the dedicated resources, training, necessary equipment, including charging infrastructure, to support customer uptime then. So we see the dealer role as continued key to success to ensure uptime, just as before, maybe even more important. Then the one thing that's adding complexity, of course, when no one questions whether the diesel pump is working, now charging is really part of uptime. So that means that we need to spend time and resources to continuously test for interoperability with a number of charging equipment manufacturers. So those relationships and partnerships are important for us to manage quality, coordinate software update, both on the trucks and the chargers then, together with those partners. Then also, this is not unique for electric vehicles. We think it's a good idea with service agreements, and we do offer that on the Mack side. We call it Ultra Service Agreement, gold contracts on the Volvo side. It's not mandatory, but that's optional, and that can be a help to ensure peace of mind when operating the equipment. Then, of course, it is about training and certification, and safety comes into play also. Health and safety is always a priority for us as a company. The tools I described earlier around route analysis, that is new capabilities, of course, to support customers in analyzing and understand where it makes sense. Then there is a lot of local partnerships, as indicated before here, and usually local in nature with EPCs, the utility, of course, and that varies by state and region in the US. So that is key to managing it as well.
It's really helpful to hear from a current trusted partner for many of the fleets on the line. I want to bring Ryan and Electrada back into the discussion here because you are a new type of business for fleets, and thinking about electricity as a fuel and on-site charging or off-site charging, depending on what works best for each fleet, is new for them. So how do fleets begin to think about their engagement with Electrada on planning for charging in contrast or in complement to hardware or engineering partners, EPCs that Daniel mentioned, software partners, the OEM, utility? What does that planning team look like for ideal fleet electrification planning?
Thanks, Nate. So first of all, let me just say that we absolutely need all of the players you mentioned, right? The hardware, the software, the engineering. Everyone in this ecosystem is absolutely critical to make this technology revolution, which is transportation electrification, to work. And we need each other to make this thing happen. I think our experience in the market to date is that this whole fleet electrification process is really complex. You know, we've worked with a lot of fleet managers or facility folks who one day learned that they needed to electrify X% of their fleet in 6 months because of a board mandate or previously because of regulatory compliance or whatever. And maybe they've done a pilot here or there, or maybe they're starting from scratch, but the reality is that their core business tends to focus on moving people and products around efficiently and at scale. It's not necessarily energy infrastructure development. And so, they've found out that preparing to electrify ends up being this convoluted process, from figuring out the right funding and whether they have budget for this kind of capital expense, to working with the utilities to select the right tariffs, to identifying the right hardware and software providers and ensuring full interoperability, like Daniel mentioned, to contracting out the design and the engineering and the construction and the O&M and guaranteeing the uptime. And that's basically the reason why Electrada was born as a company, to be able to step in as the easy button kind of for the end-to-end process, covering capital needs when necessary, managing interactions with the utility, running the full scope of everything associated with the project development lifecycle. And I think that's probably a little bit different than some of the ways that fleets have engaged with certain particular partners in a more verticalized fashion before. What we try to do is be the great conductor that brings together all components of the ecosystem, that collaboratively produce a great product that gets them to market and operational much faster. And so I think that's probably a slightly different approach than maybe what others have experienced in the past.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's why we're so excited you were able to join us, that you're helping put this on, because I think it's important for fleets to learn that there are new trusted partners out there that they can rely on. Now, I know this is really a critical topic, but we are also diving into much greater detail, including the essential role of the utility and how to partner with utilities on our very next webinar a week from today at this very same time. So I am going to move us to the ins and outs of charging and infrastructure planning. Please make sure to join us again next week for more on partnerships. And please continue to submit your questions. There's quite a few that are coming in around this topic of planning, about operations and such. And I will start drawing on those as we get into this. I'd love for the panel to really help us set this up, thinking through project infrastructure and sizing. Now, we have all heard about very long project lead times and high costs. There's been a couple questions already submitted on this very, very topic in the during the webinar. That obviously can be associated with some projects, but not others, and certainly projects that have higher charging capacity. As we get more into the nitty-gritty of charging and infrastructure for the rest of our discussion, I'd like to start with our fleets on the line. So Alex, as the chief engineer at First Student, you have hundreds of buses charging daily. I imagine you've thought a lot about designing charging to fit the site and operation. How do you design a project so that it's not overbuilt and incurring additional time and cost? And what size of chargers and ratio of charging are you planning for?
Well, there's a lot there to unpack, Nate, but we'll dive into it. So, you know, if you look at our duty cycle in school bus, there's kind of a sweet node there, 30 kilowatt, and I'm talking about just focusing on DCFC, 30 kilowatt on the low end and 60 kilowatt on the top end. One of the things that we have is a proprietary modeler that looks at that particular duty cycle, and we really strive to match a battery with a charger, because what we don't want to do, you always have to keep in mind the OEM has an upper charge limit on that battery, and realistically anything over and above that you do, you're just paying for additional capacity that you potentially can't use. Secondarily, we want to charge that battery at the lowest rate we can to always preserve the state of health of that battery, because we're looking to get 10 years, 12 years out of that battery if we can, right? So we're always cognizant of that. The other piece is that you spoke to is the, substantial cost with charging infrastructure. And so we've taken a little bit of a different avenue at First Student, and we've designed our own infrastructure that's called First Charge. I think we have a little bit of a quick slide for that. And so what we've strived to do is to drive the cost down, Nate, and effectively what we have here is a cargo container that has all the critical infrastructure in it from the standpoint of our switchgear, our mains, our branch breakers. On this particular picture, we've got our transformer sitting on top of it. We have our fire detection in there, all of our communications, and all of this is built at an ISO 9001 facility off-site, and it ships into the location as a kit. The other thing about this is that everything is above ground. We use jersey barriers as the ballast for our chargers. In this case, you can see in the picture, it's a wall mount. We also deploy PCSs with DC bus lines down to a dispenser, and then we have PCS cabinets that are all in one, which still maintain the same philosophy of effectively, we don't want anything in the ground. I want the same level of quality. I want the continuity of equipment, and we can buy that in large masses, drive the cost down, and I'm not relying and or having to educate a multitude of, be it contractors and or electricians in the field, to where mistakes are made and or we don't get the same level of deployment that we do having it all built down a 9001 certified assembly line. Additionally, if you look at resilience, right, because I call it the crawl, walk, run, right, we're seeing based on funding a lot of, at least in the school bus space, a lot of deployment of, we'll say, 5 to 10 to 15 units, and then they follow that up with next year, there may be another 5 to 10 to 15 units. So you got that crawl, you got that walk, and then you finally decide that you're going to electrify an entire site. With our infrastructure, what you see there on the screen, effectively, you can do from 1 to potentially 80 vehicles off of that, right? So when we deploy this on site, whether I'm deploying 5 units and then I'm going to follow that up in another year and a half with another 30, and then another year and a half with another 30 or 40 on top of that, I only put the infrastructure in there one time. And so it's a Lego building block plug and play system. And that really, to be honest, we have seen this in relation to other building deployments that we're roughly 20 to 30% cheaper than any other construction method, and we have the built-in resilience. So just things to think about moving forward on how do we continue to maintain and manage the cost as we start to deploy and scale this technology across a multitude of applications.
What a great solution, Alex. We got a question that came in as we were talking about how this has changed, this product has changed your opportunity for charging. How does this above ground infrastructure program affect your electrification? I would imagine by bringing down costs and having a compact footprint that it expands the number of sites that you can then electrify.
It does, Nate, and I'll tell you one of the other big factors that it allows us to do, because we're buying so much switchgear and other componentry. I have these systems already built and on the shelf. So if I need to deploy and electrify something, theoretically, as long as I've got the power there from the utility, I can stand an entire facility of 40, 50 units up within less than a month. So the stuff rolls in as long as I've got a fork truck and an electrician to hook it up. Again, I put it akin to much like you go to Home Depot and you buy a refrigerator, it gets delivered, you plug it in, you put your groceries in, and you start using the refrigerator. That's the philosophy that we've used with this. I want to be able to deploy the appliance, plug it in, and start using it immediately. So what that's done ultimately has opened us up to much faster scaling of deployment of BEV.
That's great. I want to turn to the other fleet on the line. Alexa, you've got somewhat different experience, both because you run a higher power charging operation and because you made a commitment to 50 Class 8 tractors at your Chino, California facility as part of a grant application. Now, look, I know that the first time you do anything is always going to be the most challenging, especially when you make a commitment that big. And so if you had to do that project all over again, what would you do differently in terms of sizing it for the operational need and anything you have learned to reduce cost and time?
Yeah, good question. I think if we just had to pick one thing to do all over is maybe not be the guinea pig, but I'm just kidding. We've learned a lot on this journey, right? So the project that we're talking about there is 38 350 kilowatt chargers with solar on site next door on the warehouse, feeding into 7 megawatt hours of battery energy storage. So this was a part of a grant project, right? So to run 50 vehicles, we are now well over 70 vehicles. And we do have other charging within, the Southern California area to help support our over 70 drayage vehicles right now. But this primary site in Ontario is what, really took the time for us and we're still working through. So I think going back, I don't know if we would necessarily do anything different for sizing wise. I think we already are going to see the positive impact once we can turn on the solar and the battery energy storage to help us, pull power when it's off peak. So, as Alex mentioned, that is a big part of our planning, especially in those states that have a utility tariff. If it's got an on-peak time, that's really going to change the ROI for you. So for us, specifically looking at, a new property where, we went and we looked out there to build something brand new. We secured the land and we thought, let's, go big or go home. And I think it was more or less that some of the partners that we had at the time and, even our own construction team, that wasn't something they were used to. They were not a construction team that normally did charging infrastructure. So when we added some of, the different features, solar and battery storage, that's when it got classified into a different category, where that's where we saw a lot of those lead times get pushed out a couple of years even. So we kind of pivoted at that moment too, like Alex, right? Knowing we need to get this going. So we did do temp power, and we've been running 10 of our chargers currently. We should be pulling those 10 chargers down soon, and then hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll stand all 38 of those chargers up. So we're very excited about that. But for us and the planning on that side, I think what we would really look to do differently is make other partners in the meantime, knowing that this is going to be a long-term project and we're going to see the delays. I think that that's something that even doing a new project on, the opposite coast now, we're seeing the same type of delay. So temp power, as Alex has found, may be that first initial way to get going. For our yard trucks, we don't seem to have that issue, and that's mostly due to the power needed for the yard truck trailers or chargers is there and available, and also easier to pull. Whereas when we come to these heavy duty projects for 50 truck fleet, it definitely just had its growing pains being one of the first in the nation. But I think overall we've been able to manage as best as we can, and we're excited to get that up and going to support the rest of the tractors as well. But for us, like Electrada, finding those partners that have the full knowledge. Volvo's a huge partner for us. We've used, as Daniel was talking about, actually seeing the different lanes and what may work for your vehicle, right? And then doing that same thing on the charging side. For us, charging uptime is huge now, right? And that's not something we ever worried about, like Daniel mentioned. We would just go and fuel and move on with our day. So for us, that's been the biggest thing. So finding, whether it be public chargers or whether it be, third party, owners of real estate that are also getting into charging, trying to also have those partners so that we can continue to build the network. So we don't have to just rely on, exactly what NFI is putting in, and we can rely on a greater network with, other carriers as well.
Put a pin in that because I do want to get back to en route charging and just planning a broader network. But I also want to bring Ryan into the conversation because I think we've highlighted a couple of topics here. One of which is really around right sizing from the get-go. But then that becomes a little more complex when, for example, you might want to plan for 10 heavy-duty vehicles today with the option to expand to 50 if the operation is successful. How does Electrada advise your customers and build hubs that help them for those scenarios?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nate, and I think thankfully Alexa and Alex touched on several great points here. But ultimately, it's a beautiful balance between future-proofing for additional scale of deployed EVs in the next several years and also maximizing the efficiency of your capital spend on the infrastructure. We know that labor tends to account for anywhere from 70 to 80% of total spend on any fleet EV depot development. That's the cost of the engineers and the designers and the construction and the trenching and actually putting the stuff together. And that's really significant. So that means that we want to break ground just once so that we don't have to repeat that spend later. And I think Alex mentioned that earlier too. So what we'll do is, oftentimes we'll drop in all of the underground infrastructure needed to support the future scale of the fleet. We'll work proactively with the fleet customer to understand what a programmatic approach over the next 5 years, year 1, 30 vehicles, year 2, 20, year 3, 30 more, whatever that may be, usually through this kind of TCO analysis that I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. And then we'll only drop in the actual charging endpoints once the additional vehicles scale up over time. So we're kind of only ramping up the cost associated with that additional scale as the vehicles are delivered. And that way you don't have kind of stranded and underutilized CapEx sitting in a lot that isn't getting its full potential of ROI while the rest of the fleet hasn't grown to that full scale. So it's it's a lot of future proofing. It's understanding specifically how you can align with the ongoing needs of the fleet growth, while at the same time trying to kind of minimize the capital spend to enhance the productivity of the business.
Yeah, that's great, and it's a challenge no matter how you go about it. It sounds like you have to kind of budget ahead of time for that first project, even if it's only 10, to get that labor spend under the belt, and then eventually you can expand. Well, good. We are getting a number of questions on complementary technology, things that are either currently emerging, coming to market, such as the megawatt charging standard, or that Alexa's actually already referenced, where there's on-site generation and solar. And so I'd love to ask anyone on the panel who can help our fleet audience think through, when should I be considering megawatt charging? Under what scenarios? What types of fleet operations? When should I be thinking about using on-site generation or on-site electric storage? That's for anyone on the panel.
I can touch on, I could start with the on-site generation and storage. So for us, I think that piece really comes into play when you've got your own land already secured. So for us, right, we already had a warehouse nearby. We were able to secure the property right next door to then build on top of that our charging infrastructure. And so we already had the land and the ability to have that on-site generation. And then for the storage piece, for us, it goes back to the utility tariffs and being able to pool for that on or that off-peak price when it is on peak and still be able to charge during that. So mostly around cost savings. It wouldn't necessarily be able to offset and be a sustainability factor, but yeah, I would say mostly when it comes into play for us on the utility tariff side, when there's an on and off peak introduced on the East Coast, we don't, the project we're currently working through does not have that on and off peak price. So we aren't necessarily looking at needing any storage and, needing anything to kind of ensure that we're going to be operable there.
That's really helpful. Anything to add, Daniel or Alex, on megawatt charging or on-site generation?
Yeah, I can have one comment to start at least. I mean, as I think Alex, you were into it before. I mean, you want to, based on the need, you don't want to overinvest in chargers. I mean, it's more expensive, and it should be based on the need and the use case. Then we are committed. We don't sell trucks today with mega charging capabilities, but we are committed to the standard. So coming generation trucks will have that, but also backward compatible with CCS. So
I think just to supplement Alexa, Nate, we kind of have an advantage in school bus because our duty cycle is very conducive to V to X. And so back to where those tariffs are favorable for bidirectional flow, that's a huge consideration. And, you may be aware that we're in process of building the nation's first distributed, aggregated, virtual power plant in downtown New York. And, when you start to look at how much resident power is available versus what your need is and the time that it's going to take to pull that additional power to you, that's when then you need to start considering whether it be, other aggregated resources, solar, prime power on generation. In our case, we're using a mainspring generator combined with about 6 other aggregated assets to form a microgrid and that quote virtual power plant to offset what we need, right? So those are all considerations. And when you're talking about generating and or storing power on your own local facility and whether or not you can even get that power for what you need to run your operation.
And I'm glad you also mentioned V2X, V2G, also an essential emerging technology to be watching and figuring out. And it sounds like you're going to be enabling some new capacity to come online on one of the most capacity-constrained locations in the nation, on Manhattan Island, it sounds like. I want to move. There's been a couple questions actually around training and certification for your facilities, for your fleets, your employees. Can any of you really outline one or more of the certifications or trainings that have become essential for your electrification planning?
I'm keen to hear what my fleet colleagues here have to say about that. But the only thing I would mention is from the training side is getting a site ready to take on a new technology has a big change management component to it, right? This is oftentimes, a lot of drivers and on-site operators are used to running the same fuel, the same technology that they've been doing for the last 70 plus years. And so there's a real component around human capital and change management and how you implement that change. And so, for example, we'll have folks on site at our customer depots weeks before we go live to run full, training with all of the on-site operators. We'll make sure there's full interoperability testing with the OEMs. We run all of our testing and training and certifications at our site outside of Charlotte on a Duke Energy facility. We make sure all of the hardware and software is up to spec and ready to support our uptime commitments. And I think translating all of that knowledge and in a very comfortable way with the folks who are actually in the day-to-day of the operation well in advance of go live is absolutely critical.
And
yeah, go ahead, Dane.
Yeah, and I mentioned before dealer certification. I mean, health and safety is part of that. Not anyone can work on the electric trucks. That is critical. Maybe also training related driver training is important as well, because you have regenerative braking and which can extend range, and so that is important, and also in refuse applications, how you use the body and those kind of things.
Yeah, as Daniel mentioned, we don't necessarily have certifications and trainings yet for the vehicles themselves. Mostly basic things at this moment. But our drivers are all trained prior to, going into an electric vehicle. The techs still are trained in, various things they're able to keep up with at this time. And then on the operations side, it's mostly, training on maybe the website of the chargers or how to, track and be able to, when you're going to dispatch somebody, ensuring that that tractor is filled, right? Or that, that route is EV friendly.
All good points. Really, really glad that question came up. I want to move to our last set of questions around route planning for charging. We had some questions earlier, and this came up around how do you plan for behind the fence? How do you plan for en route, maybe public depots and hubs? I'd like to start with Daniel, if you could help around how you help fleets evaluate and plan for various charging options that could include behind the fence, public, or contracted third-party hubs.
Yeah. So then, as a trusted partner together with our dealers, then we are there to support from the beginning, also when it comes to charging and infrastructure. So we have dedicated resources and advisory services through Mack and Volvo together with our dealers then. As you say, when it comes to charging, there are many options, and the desire and the capabilities to manage in-house versus with a partner varies depending on many different things then. So we are really there to support all approaches, and we can help you do it for you. We can do it with you and recommend partners, or you can do it on your own. So that is our approach to it. That also includes then support around incentives and grants also for infrastructure. We can do financing of infrastructure as well. Relations with utilities, helping streamline processes. Usually, if it's possible, depot behind the fence, whether on your own or with a partner, is probably the preferred option. If that's not an option or desirable, there are companies, third-party hubs that you can contract with. That can be a good option. I also want to emphasize when it comes to public charging, because build-out of public charging is slower in the US than what we see in Europe, and there are different reasons for that. One is regulations. We still see public charging as critical to enable the full transition and get the benefits of opportunity charging to extend range, do more routes, reduce range anxiety, and so forth. So we are one of the co-founders of PACT, which is an industry association powering America's commercial transportation. So they basically work on the goal to accelerate deployment of accessible and reliable charging then for medium duty and heavy duty vehicles. Then we're also working on establishing partnerships for a service we announced last year, Volvo Open Charge. And that's something we rolled out successfully in Europe, and that will help make public charging more accessible for customers also in the US.
Similar question over to Electrada, and you get to take us home really as the hub developer, the behind the fence charging developer and operator. How do you help your customers to think through their plans for behind the fence and maybe even a shared hub or opportunity charging strategy?
Sure. So, we've had some conversations with customers who are actually exploring shared capacity utilization at their own behind the fence sites to try and maximize those utilization rates and drive down the cost. A lot of those are kind of exploratory because a lot of customers indeed actually want to fully utilize everything they have, but some are starting to look at additional ongoing growth and how to look at shared capacity utilization, particularly in kind of like logistical hubs. I think that for a mixed use behind the fence and shared hub charging strategy, we often see the best alignment happening kind of on the extremes of the vehicle class spectrum. So either really light duty passenger vehicles and really heavy duty over the road trucks on the two different ends of that spectrum. So use cases like fleets of autonomous vehicles or non-autonomous shared mobility and taxi services that charge at a depot, run a bunch of pickups, drop-offs around town. They may have some potential for opportunity charging along the way in more far out areas of their coverage zone, likely with some kind of pre-contracted partners at shared hubs, and they may come back to base at their behind the fence location to refuel again at some point. And then you also have kind of the heavy duty use cases where there may be a big rig which is going to charge up at a distribution center or wherever it's leaving from at the start of its route. Go run an 800-mile route with a few charging stops along the way, along kind of a charging freight corridor, and then charge again at the next DC or behind the fence drop-off destination. And that's, again, primarily because of the technological constraints with vehicle battery ranges within that particular segment. So, it's interesting to see, a lot of times the in-between, right? So kind of class 2B to class 6 kind of falls nicely within that Goldilocks zone for a lot of depot charging, where they can be served. The great majority of their use cases and routes can be served with that type of charging. Whereas a lot of the stuff, while there's certainly use cases for those both ends in pure depot charging, we often see more mixed use cases and really light duty and really heavy duty long range stuff.
This is really helpful. And this has been such a rich conversation. I just genuinely appreciate the time and expertise that each of you has brought to this. There are quite a few questions that, of course, we could not get to. And so for those of you who have submitted questions that we have not yet answered, we will share those with the panelists. And hopefully they'll be able to answer to you directly. I want to give a big thank you really to my expert panelists for your time today. Don't forget to register for our next webinar in the State of Sustainable Fleets Charging Infrastructure Academy series. This one next week at the same time. We'll be building utility and other charging partnerships exactly 1 week from today. A link to a recording of this discussion will be emailed to you in the next couple of days with a survey. We would value your feedback on this and the entire Charging Infrastructure Academy series. Don't forget to join us in person for ACT Expo, and thank you for your time and participation and, of course, your great questions today. Have a great day.